We've been looking at some introductory issues in relation to the Book of Revelation. We've thought about its author. Is it John the Apostle, John the Elder, or some other well-known John? We've thought about the date. Was it at the time of Nero, at the time of Domitian, or some other time? We've thought about some how-tos, how it typically is understood, the different schools of interpretation, preterism, believing that it was all done and dusted, all in the first century or the first few centuries, historicism, believing that it marks the progress of history through the ages, futurism, believing that it all really applies to the very last days, days that haven't yet arrived or are only on the point of arriving, and idealism, where these are really just ideas, symbols, metaphors, principles. And we've also really discussed a little bit of, if you like, the principles of how we ought to be looking at the book. In this video, I want to venture into an area that is even more speculative in a way, although I'll have more to say about speculation at some point in the future. But I think we need some kind of structure, some way of getting a handle on how we understand the Book of Revelation, what's going on here. And so I want to be looking at that structure and perhaps to raise a particular question about whether we are seeing something in a linear fashion or whether we are seeing some kind of cyclical or repeating patterns. So let's take a look. So we are looking at the structure of Revelation, or I perhaps should say a particular approach to the structure of Revelation. And I guess the first question is the obvious question, that is, does Revelation have a structure? It does have to be said that on first reading, Revelation kind of feels a little bit amorphous. It's a little bit difficult to kind of see how it all fits together. And that's partly because John obviously puts in lots of little extras as he goes through the story. But it seems to me that there are two basic approaches to answering this question about does Revelation have a structure? I mean, the answer is that everyone sort of says yes, but of these two basic approaches, one is to say, well, no, it tells a single story from start to finish. Well, that's a structure, so it has got a structure, but it's not. There's no structure within it, as it were. It just, you begin at the beginning, you go through it until you get to the end. And I guess that's how kind of instinctively you expect to read it, because that's how you instinctively expect to read most books. It does have to be said that in terms of the non-letters, and even some letters perhaps would fit this pattern, but in terms of the non-letters, the writers of that period didn't work that linearly. So even the Gospels, you know, it's been made clear that they're not really putting it down in time sequence. They put it down in a kind of sequence that makes sense to the writer. So, you know, to say that it's from start to finish is actually making quite a big hypothesis in itself. It seems to us like, if you like, the default position, and you have to justify doing any other way. But actually, you know, look at the Gospels. Acts is a little bit more linear, perhaps, but in general, you do have to say you can't automatically assume that that is the default position. And so the second possible approach is the answer is yes, and the story is repeated from different viewpoints. Unsurprisingly, perhaps, my perception, I may be wrong here, but my perception is that most historicists and many, if not most, futurists adopt the first approach, that you work through in this single direction. It's almost what determines that they take either a historicist or a futurist approach. But actually there are people who have adopted all the approaches, all four of the fundamental approaches. There are many who adopt option B, that in fact there are cycles, even if those cycles are fairly basic. So for example, with a lot of preterists, they will see, if you like, kind of two cycles, one relating to Jerusalem, one relating to Rome. Those are the non-full preterists, if you like. But even the people who think that it applies to Jerusalem, you find that they'll say John is going over the message to some extent. Some will say that. Some futurists recognise that John kind of goes back and emphasises slightly different things about certain events. And of course, idealists will tend to see things in patterns anyway. But it does have to be said also that it's not as if, for those that do believe that there's some kind of repeat, some pattern, it's not as if they all agree on how that pattern works. So there's nothing kind of obvious that you can pin your analysis on, and thereby, in a sense, hangs the problem, because we have no pattern, no repeating structure that jumps out at you. So let's begin looking at it, and I want to just, if you like, introduce one phenomenon that I've noticed, one thing that may help identify the patterns, and if you like, give you a little bit of a structure. But it's very, very broad brush and very general, and I haven't honed it down to any details. The first thing I've assumed is that in chapters 1 to 3, kind of it stands apart. So we've got the introduction in chapter 1 where we encounter Jesus. It's a vision already, so it is part of the book. You've got to be careful here. But it kind of seems to stand alone, although some of the themes and some of the ideas recur later in the book. And then you get the 7 letters in chapters 2 and 3, which again kind of pretty much stand alone. It's all introduction. There is a gulf of character and nature between the letters and what follows in chapter 4. You suddenly enter into a whole different domain. Now, it does have to be said that some believe that chapters 2 and 3 are part of that scheme as well, and maybe even chapter 1. Some historicists, for example, believe that they represent different eras of history, so that as you chase through the churches in the sequence that John has put them, so you see the character of the church in that period. Some idealists and others think they represent all types of churches in all ages, so that it's not just random and it's not just happening to be the 7 churches that he writes to in Asia, but that these are all the churches that you can find in one way or another. I have a little problem with that, which I've already touched on in a previous video, because I think most of the people that believe even these additional elements about the letters believe they are also real letters. In which case they're really saying there are 2 truths. John has 2 things in mind when he writes them. And I have a problem with that. I think you've got to be very careful about that. Now, if they actually are saying they weren't really written to the churches, that was just a device, then there are all sorts of questions. Would John really do that for churches that are identifiable? They seem to be related to specific churches, and churches that John would have known well, and even the order is significant. So it's very unlikely that they didn't relate to the church, to the specific churches in some way. So I've got a little bit of a problem with the idea that they can be something over and above letters to the churches. But, it's a possibility. You need to bear it in mind. So chapter 1, chapter 2 and chapter 3 kind of stand apart. And then we enter the book. Chapters 4 and 5 are a kind of introduction to the seals. Chapter 4, you've got the throne room. Chapter 5, you've got praise to the Lamb who brings the seals. So the clear themes in the book from where I'm sitting start at chapter 6, where you actually see the 7 seals being broken. Or perhaps I should say 6 of the 7 seals. I watched as the Lamb opened the first of the 7 seals. Then I heard one of the 4 living creatures say in a voice like thunder, "Come." Not sure I can do the voice like thunder, but there you go. I looked, and there before me was a white horse. Its rider held a bow, and he was given a crown, and he rode out as a conqueror bent on conquest. Now this is clearly an image of either a person or a nation or an army of some sort or some scheme conquering. Now I've put this specifically, I've quoted this one because there kind of seem to be 2 specific interpretations. One says that it is a particular country or nation, maybe Rome, maybe some eastern state, who come in kind of conquest. The other is that it's Jesus, because we have other images where Jesus rides on a white horse, and he is imposing his authority. So, I don't know about that, but I don't want to make an assumption, so I've simply quoted the thing. But then we get the 2nd seal broken, and you get the red horseman, who represents rebellion and social unrest. You get the 3rd seal being broken, you get the black horseman, representing economic distress. And then you get the 4th seal, and you get the pale horseman, and he represents death and Hades. Violence, famine, and plague are mentioned. So these are the first 4 seals. We're given quite a lot of information about those. There's a certain amount of pattern and rhythm to these first 4 seals. Now I've here said the white horseman reflects authority, represents authority. It may represent Jesus. So these are the first 4 seals we find in chapter 6. And then in fact we're introduced to the 5th seal, which is persecution and martyrdom. The souls of those who are in white under the altar. And then the 6th, which is earthquakes and astronomical disaster, the earth falling upon those who are there, those who are suffering. And I have to say that it sounds like the end. Even this early in Revelation chapter 6, it sounds like he's talking about the end. I watched as he opened the 6th seal. There was a great earthquake. The sun turned black like sackcloth made of goat hair. The whole moon turned blood red, and the stars in the sky fell to earth as figs drop from a fig tree when shaken by a strong wind. The heavens receded like a scroll being rolled up, and every mountain and island was removed from its place. Now, this sounds like the end of the world. And in fact, if you track through to the Old Testament, you will find that it fits predictions of the day of the Lord. And he goes on. Then the kings of the earth, the princes, the generals, the rich, the mighty, and everyone else, both slave and free, hid in caves and among the rocks of the mountains. They called to the mountains and the rocks, "Fall on us and hide us from the face of him who sits on the throne and from the wrath of the Lamb. For the great day of their wrath has come, and who can withstand it?" Now, pardon me, this sounds like the end. And interestingly enough, you then go on a little bit further and you get into the trumpets, and suddenly you're back with normal life. And a third of this is damaged and a third of that is damaged. What happened to everyone in the world, from the princes and the generals through to the slaves and the free, hiding, asking the rocks to fall on them? What happened? Where did that go? It sounds like the end. So we have the 7 seals, and it sounds like the story's over. And then we get the 7 trumpets. When we get to the 7th seal, hey presto, it all starts over again, and we start on the trumpets. So trumpet 1, we get hail, fire and blood, and land plants are impacted. Trumpet 2, sea turned to blood, marine life impacted. And then trumpet 3, a star falls to the earth, land-based water sources are impacted. And then trumpet 4, an astronomical disaster, light sources are impacted. Trumpet 5, demonic locusts are released from the abyss to torment. And trumpet 6, an attack by the 4 angels of the Euphrates. So there is a certain parallelness between the breaking of the seals and the trumpets. And here we are again. So we need to think a little bit about that. And then in fact we have to ask the question, where's the 7th trumpet? We've said that trumpets 1 to 6 are in chapters 8 and 9. So what we expect to follow on from that is trumpet number 7. And we don't get that. We get a chapter with an angel and a small scroll. It's all about this small scroll, and John is given that scroll to eat, and he eats it, and it describes what happens to him. And then chapter 11, John is given a measuring rod, and he is to measure the temple. And then in fact we're told the story of 2 witnesses who are in fact under a lot of pressure from something rather undesirable. And then suddenly the 7th trumpet. So maybe all of this happens kind of between the 6th trumpet and the 7th trumpet. Okay. So now we've got to the 7th trumpet. We've got to chapter 11, we've got the 7th trumpet. And you know, it sounds a bit like the end. Listen to this. The kingdom of the world has become the kingdom of our Lord and of his Messiah, and he will reign forever and ever. 11:15. The kingdom of the world has become the kingdom of earth. It sounds like the end. We give thanks to you, Lord God Almighty, the one who is and who was. It's not to and who is to come. Notice, because he's no longer to come. We give thanks to you, Lord God Almighty, the one who is and who was, because you have taken your great power and have begun to reign. Well, you could read that in the Christian sense that he's already reigning. But you know, it's in a particular position. The time has come for judging the dead and for destroying those who destroy the earth. Now, it's not quite as clear, crystal clear as the first section perhaps, but it does sound like the end. And it, you know, we're already beginning to say, is there some kind of repetition here, some kind of cycle? We had the seals and how that worked coming to an end. We now got the trumpets, and that seems to be coming to an end. So we've got the 7 seals in chapter 6. Well, 6 of them. We've got the 7 trumpets in chapter 8 and 9. Well, 6 of them. We then get the tempest, the temple, the 2 witnesses, and the 7th trumpet. And then, in fact, we get another kind of interlude, another something that doesn't really fit the pattern. You know, we've not got 7s here. We've just got something happening. We're introduced to a dragon and a monster. 2 monsters, in fact. Now, they're usually called beasts, but monster is a reasonable interpretation of the word as well. So dragon and 2 monsters, although one of them is the main monster. Ironically, both the dragon and the first monster look exactly the same. They have 7 heads and 10 horns. And that probably indicates that the monster is really a representation or a representative of the dragon. The dragon is identified as Satan. So in chapters 12-15, we get a little story about what they do, how they work, what they're doing. And you know, at the end of it, it sounds like the end. Now that's a little surprising because we haven't got 7 anythings, and yet we still seem to be getting a sort of end story. I looked, and there before me was a white cloud, and seated on the cloud was one like a son of man, with a crown of gold on his head and a sharp sickle in his hand. Then another angel came out of the temple and called in a loud voice to him who was sitting on the cloud, "Take your sickle and reap, because the time to reap has come, for the harvest of the earth is ripe." Now we know that image. That's the image that Jesus has given us. And he's saying we're ready for the end. So he who was seated on the cloud swung his sickle over the earth, and the earth was harvested. Now, maybe I'm reading too much into it, but that does sound like the end. Revelation 14. And it goes on. Another angel came out of the temple in heaven, and he too had a sharp sickle. Still another angel who had charge of the fire came from the altar and called in a loud voice to him who had the sharp sickle, "Take your sharp sickle and gather the clusters of grapes from the earth's vine, because its grapes are ripe." The angel swung his sickle on the earth, gathered its grapes, and threw them into the great winepress of God's wrath. Now, I don't know if you react the same way, but it feels pretty definite to me. So we've had the story of the breaking of the seals, which seemed to end at the end. We then had the story of the trumpets, which seemed to end at the end. And now we've got the story of the dragon and the monsters, which seemed to end at the end. And then we get to Revelation 16. Oh, and what a surprise. We end up with 7 plagues. Now, these plagues are actually released by angels tipping over bowls. Some people say they're not bowls, they're vials, but, whatever. So, we get the first plague, which is sores. Does this sound a little bit familiar? We're going back over. Okay, but, it's the story. We get to the second plague, and the sea turns to blood, and everything in the sea dies. It completes what trumpet 2 seems to have started. And then bowl 3, land, water sources are poisoned, relates to trumpet 3. And then in plague 4, fourth bowl is turned over, and the sun burns people, overturning of trumpet 4. Actually, it's kind of almost the opposite of trumpet 4. In trumpet 4, everything kind of, the light dies. Here it burns, so, and with bowl 5, we get darkness and agony. And with bowl 6, we get the drying of the Euphrates, again a development of trumpet 6. So there's obviously a link between the trumpets and the bowls, which some people would argue shows that there is a sequence. It's not cyclical, it's a sequence. But nevertheless, the message that I've already got, this thing about the ends, there seem to be an end in each of them. And then in fact we get Armageddon in Revelation 16. And then we get bowl 7 with natural disasters, which are a little bit like the 6th scroll. And I think you may guess now that after bowl 7, this time we actually have got bowl 7, which is a little bit different from the breaking scrolls and the trumpets. We've got a bowl 7, and this looks like the end. So you can see why I tend to feel that maybe we are seeing some kind of cyclical thing here. Let's give you the quotes. Okay, this is Revelation 16. "Look, I come like a thief. Blessed is the one who stays awake and remains clothed, so as not to go naked and be shamefully exposed." This is a little bit like what he writes to one of the letters. "Then they gathered the kings together to the place that in Hebrew is called Armageddon." Now everyone knows about Armageddon. If you don't know anything else in the book of Revelation, you know about Armageddon. And you know that Armageddon is about the end. The seventh angel poured out his bowl into the air, and out of the temple came a loud voice from the throne saying, "It is done." Now, that sounds pretty much like the end. Then there came flashes of lightning, rumblings, peals of thunder, and a severe earthquake. No earthquake like it has ever occurred since mankind has been on earth. So tremendous was the quake. Every island fled away, and the mountains could not be found. It's a little bit like the end of the scrolls, really. You know, this is very final. But we're only on chapter 16. So let's recap a little bit. We've already seen the 7 seals in chapter 6, which seem to end with the end. We've then seen the 7 trumpets in chapters 8 and 9, which seem to end with the end. We've then seen a dragon and 2 monsters, in fact, but the monster in chapters 12 to 15, which seem to end with the end. And now we've got the plagues and the bowls or the vials, which seem to end with the end. But in fact, the book of Revelation goes on. And we've got another story that kind of unravels and reveals. Now this is again different. It's a little bit like the dragon and the monster. You know, it doesn't fit these 7 seals, 7 trumpets, 7 vials. It's a little bit different. In fact, it's the story of Babylon. This is, with one exception, this is the first we've really heard about Babylon. But first of all, in chapter 17, Babylon is described, and all its faults and all its problems and its relationship with the monster. And then in chapter 18, we have the fall of Babylon described. And then at the beginning of chapter 19, we have rejoicing over her fall. So if you like, it's the rise and fall of Babylon. Whatever Babylon is, and there is a great deal of discussion about what Babylon represents, but don't worry about that at this stage. It is just the fact that Babylon this is yet another cycle, another sequence that seems to happen. And then in fact, at the end of chapter 19, having described its rise and its fall, we also find the defeat of the monster. And it probably won't surprise you by now, it looks remarkably like the end. So, Revelation 19. He has condemned the great prostitute who corrupted the earth by her adulteries. He has avenged on her the blood of his servants. You know, it's past tense. It's done. The smoke from her goes up forever and ever. And then you get the rejoicing. This is about Babylon now. This is the first part of chapter 19. Let us rejoice and be glad and give him glory, for the wedding of the Lamb has come. Now that's a new note. And his bride has made herself ready. Now that's unashamedly the end. Okay, so Babylon's demise seems to mark the wedding of the Lamb, or the beginning, the preparation for the wedding of the Lamb. And then in fact we find later in the chapter the monster's defeat. I saw heaven standing open, and there before me was a white horse whose rider is called Faithful and True. And if we were in any doubt, a little bit further on in the description, his name is the Word of God. And coming out of his mouth is a sharp sword with which to strike down the nations. He will rule them with a rod of iron, an iron scepter. He treads the winepress of the fury of the wrath of God Almighty. On his robe and on his thigh he has the name written, King of Kings and Lord of Lords. I think we know who this is. This is Jesus. But we've had Jesus coming before with his army. And of course there is the question of whether this is the final coming or not. And then what does he do there? Then I saw the beast and the kings of the earth and their armies gathered together to wage war against the rider on the horse and his army. Now, I'm sorry, but Isn't that a description of Armageddon? But we had Armageddon in chapter 16. So what's going on here? But the beast was captured, and with it the false prophet who had performed the signs on its behalf. That was the other monster, in fact. The two of them were thrown alive into the fiery lake of burning sulphur. The rest were killed with the sword coming out of the mouth of the rider on the horse, and all the birds gorged themselves on their flesh. Yeah, it's pretty graphic. But this sounds like the end yet again. So I'm going to summarize again. I'm sorry I keep doing this, but I want to emphasize kind of the structure of where we are and what we've looked at. We got the introduction, chapter 1, no problem. And we've got the letters, chapter 2 and 3. Bit of a discussion over whether they mean more than just letters. But, you know, basically those kind of sit separate. We then had the heavenly throne room and the introduction to the seals, chapters 4 and 5. And then we had the seven seals, chapter 6. And we saw that the end of the 6 seals, in fact, we seem to have the end. And then we had 6 out of 7 trumpets, chapters 8 and 9. And once again, we seem to reach the end. And then we had the measuring of the temple, the 2 witnesses, and the 7th trumpet, in fact, in chapter 11. And we seem to get the end. And then we had a dragon and a monster, chapters 12 to 15. And we seem to get to the end. Then we had the 7 vials, or the 7 plagues, in chapter 16. And we seem to come to the end. And then we had Babylon and her fall, chapter 17 to 19, and then we seem to come to the end. Notice a pattern. And it seems to me not unreasonable to say that each of these are talking about, more or less, in various ways, the same reality, but perhaps from different viewpoints or different positions. And there is certainly a number of key repetitions. I've mentioned Armageddon, for example, that happens in 2 of those circumstances. We've certainly found with the trumpets and the plagues that there's quite a lot of similarity between them. And so, having got that far, we come to chapter 20, which is the millennium. Now, I really don't want to say too much about this millennium because it's a whole different ball game, and everyone seems to come a cropper one way or another, seems to have an idea of what this means. But there is one agreement that actually seems to be true of this millennium, and that is that it is the end. It is the end. We have actually come to the end. If we are working in strict sequence, remember we said that there are 2 ways of approaching this. One is to take them in a cyclical fashion, which I think I've been trying to justify effectively, but one of them is to take the book from start to finish just as it is. And if in fact we assume that the book is in a strict sequence and it starts at the beginning, goes through the middle and comes to the end, then obviously this is near the end. It's after that return of Jesus, on a white horse, and the defeat of the monster. So it looks like Jesus has come and now we've got a millennium. And that actually describes the position of the premillennialists. So in essence, premillennialism of one sort or another requires that you take the book in a strict sequence. As soon as you raise the possibility that John is not writing from beginning to end, but that these are patterns, sequences, cycles, or however you interpret them, then it actually raises questions about where this millennium comes in relation to everything else we've been written. We've had several final endings, loads of final endings, so this may be out of sequence as well. In fact, the sequence may not be that relevant. If it's actually a new sequence, if in fact we say we're starting again, because we just had the end. We had the end in chapter 19. So why are we now coming back and talking about a millennium, which is not quite the end yet? The end happens within this story of the millennium. So if in fact this is a new start and it's a new description, albeit very basic, then actually that would imply that This is a sequence that starts at the death of Christ, or the ascension of Christ, and finishes at the return of Christ. And that defines amillennialism. There is no millennium as such. It is just a way of referring to this period between the first and the second coming of Jesus. But if we think that Jesus' actions in chapter 19 are just temporary and that he hasn't actually come yet, but this is, if you like, in sequence with that story, then maybe this happens just before his final return, and the next chapters describe his final return, and that defines postmillennialism. So you can see how all these three views kind of come out of the sort of issues we've been thinking about and looking at. But I really don't want to get into which of these is right. I have no idea. And if I'm totally honest, I'm not sure it's that important, which I guess tells you that I think I'm naturally not a premillennialist. And it seems to be the premillennialists who get really hung up on this issue more than anything else. But I may be wrong on that, so don't quote me. But it does seem to be finally the end, the very end, the end of the end, the end of ends. And chapters 21 and 22 give us a wonderful vision of Jesus' final victory, of the coming of the new Jerusalem, of heaven, although there's plenty of discussion about what that means as well, of course. So there's the structure of the book of Revelation in my mind. I see repeating patterns. I see this continual recurrence of the end, and we have to look at what John says in between. But there are some thoughts that I have that I want to kind of finish with. And the first is actually to say that this is merely one analysis. I recognise that there are plenty of people out there who would look at it in a very different way. And in fact, as part of that, there are plenty of other ways of looking for patterns. If I'd had time and if I thought that you could bear with it, I would have looked at the passages of worship. There are some of the passages where in heaven where you get worship that seem to be at the start, the beginning, the preparation. Praise God because he is the great creator, the beginner of all things. And then you get other passages of worship which seem to celebrate the final victory. He is King of Kings, he is Lord of Lords, he has conquered all his enemies. So it would be good to actually look at those and see where they occur and recur. You also get repeating phrases. I'm not going to go into those because it's a study in itself. We talked about Armageddon as one of the examples that's come up a couple of times, but there are plenty of phrases that come up time after time within the book, and perhaps there's some significance in key repeating phrases, and they also might define some of these sequences that we need to look at. But I have a question. We know from the very beginning of this book that John has experienced visions. It's not a vision, it's visions. God has spoken to John through these visions. Now, visions like dreams are not the same as the way we see the world. So should we expect John's visions to be coherent across the whole book? A lot of these analyses of the book of Revelation work on the fundamental assumption that what is said at one part of the book relates and is important and determines what is said in another part of the book. Let me take an example. In chapter 11, chapter 11, we meet the dragon. No, we don't. Chapter 12, we meet the dragon. Sorry about that. Chapter 12, we meet the dragon, and we're told that the dragon is Satan. In chapter 13, we meet the monster, the beast, who is the servant of the dragon. And we assume that there's kind of a clear, simple separation between the one and the other. You know, we're working as if it's in the real world, as if we've got a real dragon and a real monster that occurs in the world. But these are a vision. And should we expect such a coherent and such a clear separation for the one from the other. And it seems to me that the monster shows many of the characteristics of the dragon and functions as the dragon. The dragon doesn't really function very much in the rest of Revelation, but the monster does. And if we have a vision, like dreams, you find that's often these characters merge from one to the other. It's a fuzzier world. Now, I wonder if that's true in the book of Revelation. Now, in a sense, to claim that and to argue that and to try and work on the basis of that, it would actually make it even harder to interpret the book of Revelation, because it means that we've almost got no stage points. But the question remains. But whatever we think and whatever we say, I hope that I have said enough to show that the start to end view of Revelation is not necessarily the correct one, to raise the question of the cyclical interpretation of how these different parts of the book of Revelation all fit or cycle round and so on, and to raise questions about whether it is as simple and as straightforward as some of the interpreters of the book of Revelation have given the impression it is. So there we are. There's my structure, and we will talk about some of the other concerns that I have about interpretations of the book of Revelation later.